of the work that was put in place from our co-sponsors, Keene State College, which also is how Dr. Dottie Morris came to us today. She's going to be moderating our conversation. And then the New Hampshire Black Women's Health Project for co-sponsoring. A special thank you goes out to all of our attendees, and I look forward to the opportunity to engage in a really rich dialogue tonight about this really important topic. Thank you.
Okay, I couldn't unmute for a moment there. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. As we've already said, this is a discussion. This is a dialogue. So I have some questions set up for the candidates. And if you have any questions at any point, put them in the chat and we'll just go to the chat. So we'll go between the questions I have and the questions you have, as opposed to just having it in this really, really rigid way where I'm the only one asking questions. If you have a statement you want to make, we welcome statements as well. So we really want this to be a really good dialogue for the next hour. I don't know if you're aware, but we are being taped for this to be posted to the YWCA's website, just to let you know that that will be posted and available by tomorrow. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. What I'd like to happen is for the candidates to introduce themselves. We'll start in alphabetical order by last name. And so just take a few minutes to introduce yourself and to our listeners here. I think he's having trouble unmuting. So can we unmute the mic?
Got it. We're in. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and engage in this conversation. It's great to see so many via Zoom. I'm Dan Feltus. I serve as a majority leader of the state Senate. Live in the south end of Concord with my amazing wife, Erin. Our two wonderful daughters, Iris and Josie. Our two dogs, Franklin and Roosevelt. And I have a little bit of a different background and perspective than the current governor. You see, I don't come from a family of politicians. My dad worked in a furniture factory for 45 years, same one, under air conditioned, doing the same job day in and day out for 45 years. My mom, she did part-time work, including the night shift, while raising 4 kids. And the gifts they gave to me are the values of hard work, honesty and integrity, and looking out for everybody. Those are the values I've tried to live as best I can as a legal aid lawyer with New Hampshire Legal Assistance right out of law school for about a decade. Serving with New Hampshire Legal Assistance, fighting for low to middle income families, fighting for seniors, veterans, battling Wall Street banks or foreclosing on folks all across New Hampshire during the last economic crisis, the Great Recession, and leading the Housing Justice Project of New Hampshire Legal Assistance, including combating housing discrimination all across New Hampshire, working to implement the Fair Housing Project, and working with partners like Manchester NAACP and others to root out systemic discrimination in our housing market, authored the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice for the state of New Hampshire. Did that for about 10 years, served in the state Senate 3 terms, majority leader this term, worked together in bipartisan way to get real results for working people and families on the ground. We did bail reform, common sense bail reform. We did Medicaid expansion, 50,000 granted staters have health care as a consequence of that. We did prescription drug relief. We did a whole host of other measures to really move forward for ordinary folks. And that's what it's all about to me, public service, and that fundamental belief that we are all in this together. And that's what I've lived by. That's what I've strived towards in everything that I do. And, you know, let's face it, working together, we faced an obstacle at the State House. He comes by the name of Chris Sununu. Record-setting 79 vetoes, 65 of which had bipartisan support. Job training, vetoed. Addiction treatment services, vetoed. Universal background checks, vetoed. Healthcare access, vetoed. Paid family and medical leave insurance, vetoed. You know, it's that kind of approach It's no surprise he literally calls himself, his words, a Trump guy through and through. You know what? We're through with that. We got to move forward. We got to move forward together. There's so much at stake in this election: racial justice, climate justice, healthcare justice. The ACA is on the line. Education funding is on the line. Clean energy is on the line. The jobs of tomorrow are on the line. Minimum wage, paid family and medical leave insurance is on the line. Granite staters marching for change deserve a governor that doesn't smile to your face and bear hug Mike Pence and Donald Trump behind your back. We got to move forward. We got to lift each other up. We got to work to include more people in our democracy and economy, not exclude them. Work to lift each other up, fight for an economy and a relief effort that works for everybody, not just those at the top. That's what this is all about to me. That's what this is all about to me. And look, I respectfully ask for your vote and your support in this race for governor.
Thank you very much.
You got it.
Hi, my name is Darryl W. Perry. I'm the Libertarian candidate running for governor. And Dr. Morris, I thank you and Jessica and everybody else that put this together. And I also want to thank you for extending an invitation to all of the candidates that are on the ballot, because that doesn't happen with the mainstream media organizations. New Hampshire Public Radio had a debate this morning where they based debate inclusion on election results from 2 years ago. WMUR held a gubernatorial debate last night, never announced what their debate inclusion criteria was. So you have a large number of voters that don't know that they have a choice between Republican and Democrat. They don't realize that there is a third option on the ballot. Your ballot, and in fact, every ballot across this entire country will have Republicans, Democrats, and Libertarians. The Green Party also has their candidate on enough presidential ballots to theoretically win the Electoral College, but they're being excluded from debates as well. Something that I would push if elected governor is I would push the legislature to have fair ballot access laws. It's absolutely ridiculous that the Libertarian Party had to spend nearly $20,000, sue the governor, and waste hundreds, if not thousands of man hours, including man hours of city and town clerks and supervisors of the checklist verifying petitions to determine whether or not we had enough valid signatures to get onto the ballot. Something else I would do is work with both Republicans and Democrats to legalize cannabis in this state. We would actually have legalized cannabis if not for the threat of a veto by Governor Chris Sununu. We would have an independent redistricting commission if not for a veto by Governor Chris Sununu. 85% of New Hampshireites want an independent redistricting commission. 74% want legalized cannabis. 61% want to eliminate mandatory minimum sentences that we still have on the books. We need Portugal-style depenalization to end the drug war. In Portugal, you can have a 10-day supply of any illicit substance and you will not go to jail. If you have a substance abuse disorder, you get medical treatment for your medical issue. You don't get treated like a criminal. Do you know what a 10-day supply gets you in New Hampshire? Most likely felony possession with intent to distribute charges, unless your 10-day supply is very small and all in one bag. Because if you have items in separate bags, that is automatically deemed intent to distribute, whether you were intending to distribute or not. We need to end the drug war because it disproportionately affects minorities. People of color are about 5 times more likely to be in a New Hampshire jail or prison than people that look like me. If that's not systemic racism, I don't know what is, but the sitting governor says that doesn't exist. You can go to my website to learn more about where I stand on the issues, darrylwperry.com. And again, I look forward to this conversation and thank you for putting this on.
Thank you very much. So our first question is a little about your own journey as it relates to race and understanding race. So, we'll ask you to take just a couple minutes to discuss, your personal journey and your understanding of race relations. So take us on a journey with you about how did you come to understand race and race relations. So either candidate can start.
I'll go ahead and start.
Okay.
As somebody that grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, I definitely come from a different background than your average New Hampshireite. Most people in New Hampshire, especially if they were born and raised here, they're used to a very homogenous community to where the vast majority of people, and I think the latest census data showed somewhere around 90% of New Hampshireites are white. They look like me. That's not the community that I want to live in. I don't want a homogenous community. I'm used to living in neighborhoods that are multi-ethnic. And growing up as a young child in the early 80s, I didn't know the history of Birmingham, Alabama. I learned that, as I was going through school, mostly middle school, high school, elementary school. They don't, really tell you about what happened. But when Bull Connor turned the fire hoses and unleashed the dogs on peaceful protesters that were demanding equal treatment, and sadly, we're seeing very similar things across the country right now, only it's rubber bullets and tear gas, which is no better. I'm not going to say necessarily worse because it's worse in a different way. I certainly wouldn't want to be hit with a fire hose or a rubber bullet. I don't want a dog attacked on me, and I don't want to be pepper sprayed in the eyes. So I'm not trying to downplay any of what's happening. It's, the same but different, if that makes sense, of what's going on. But as a teenager in, let's say, a not so good neighborhood that I didn't know until my teens wasn't a good neighborhood because it's where my great grandmother lived. She lived there, all of her adult life. 1 block from Legion Field, where University of Alabama used to play their home football games when they played in Birmingham. Late in the day, as the sun was getting to go down, a officer on a horse rides by and looks at me and the lady that I was talking to and said, "You might want to leave. It gets dark in this neighborhood." And it was right then that I realized exactly what he was trying to say. And I shot back and said, my great grandmother lives in this house. This lady lives in this house. We're fine. If I would do that today, I'd probably be pepper sprayed, handcuffed, probably hit a few times with a baton. But it was then that I realized, something's not right here when you have police telling white people that they might not want to be in a neighborhood that they either live in or are very familiar with. And then learning the actual true history of a lot of the laws that we have on our books, specifically the drug laws. There are very racist origins to those laws. If you go, back to the early 1900s, there was the claim of weed makes Black people go after white women and listen to jazz music, and so we have to outlaw that. And then there were the anti-opium laws that passed in California in the late 1800s that specifically went after Asian Americans. But if you look at the drugs that are legal, alcohol and tobacco, who uses those? Well, it's the politicians that make the rules. So they exempt the drugs that they use, but they want to criminalize the drugs that those other people use. And I used air quotes there for anybody that might not be watching the video. Again, we need to get rid of the racist war on drugs. And I think the best way to do that is to remove all of the penalties, both civil and criminal, and allow people that have a medical problem to get medical help. You don't treat people with diabetes as criminals when they wind up having one of their insulin needles on them outside of the house. So we need to, just completely focus how
Okay.
we handle this entire situation.
Okay, thank you. Oh, your mic is muted. Can you unmute the mic? Okay, thank you.
Here we go. I'll just keep it unmuted from now on. Well, I think my journey, just like a lot of folks' journey, is incomplete. And, constantly learning and constantly striving for, a better, more perfect union. That's the story of New Hampshire. That's the story of America. And we haven't lived up to the ideals, but we are on a pathway. We need to stay on that pathway. And, look, the reason I decided to get into legal aid work to begin with was between my first and second year of law school. I worked in legal aid in downtown Detroit, legal services, combating Wall Street banks who were foreclosing on people, doing redlining, seeing the systemic practices and how they affect communities of color, and battling those and seeing firsthand what kind of an impact that has on people's lives, losing their homes, losing their livelihood, targeting in a discriminatory way, something that's so important for folks. And then taking that experience and deciding that's what I wanted to do, serve in legal aid. And that's what I've done, working to combat housing discrimination all across New Hampshire as a legal aid attorney, learning more and more about what folks face, not just the systemic discrimination that exists and systemic racism that exists on paper, but how it affects in real life. And, as you probably know, Black adults are much more likely than white adults to have persistent emotional distress, and especially if you live in poverty. And working with communities of color who are living in poverty and facing systemic racism each and every day, seeing the toll that it takes, not just on a piece of paper, not just statistics, what happens in people's lives. And, I do agree with Darryl on some of the things that Darryl said, including the legalization of marijuana, including going forward on criminal justice reform. These are all common sense steps to build a more perfect, more inclusive union. And whether subtle or overt, caught on tape or not, each and every day, Black Americans and Black Granite Staters face words, actions, and policies and practices that impact them negatively, rob them of the American dream, if not their very lives. So recognizing that is essential to how we move forward. And as Darryl mentioned, I'll just reiterate it. I think you all know it by now. The current governor does not think systemic racism exists. It does. And the first step in combating it is acknowledging it does. And, I've been fortunate to not just do the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice in the housing context, but also working with folks on the ground and knowing what kind of impact and toll it takes on folks. So we got to move forward together. If we move forward together, you got to recognize what's going on in people's lives, listen to one another. The best ideas come from the ground up, not the top down, and continue to do that process. And so, like I said, my journey is incomplete. I think the journey of this country is incomplete, without a doubt. And so let's move forward together on the journey together.
Thank you. So I have another question for you. And if we could keep the answers to like 2 minutes or so, that would be great. What do you think are the 3 most pressing issues facing people of color in the United States and specifically in New Hampshire? And what is your analysis of how these issues are having an impact on people of color living in New Hampshire? Or do you think people of color are not experiencing these issues in New Hampshire? And either candidate can start.
Well, Darryl, do you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead, Dan.
All right.
I went first
think
last time.
Thank you, Darryl. Look, this comes from leadership. I think that I honestly believe the most divisive leader that we probably had in the history, close to the history of our country, at least in the last few decades, is Donald Trump. And Donald Trump has made things much worse. And his violent and hateful rhetoric targeting persons of color, targeting folks marching for change, the failure to disavow white supremacy, those words matter. Leadership matters, and words matter. And it results in conduct on the ground where it does not appeal to people's better angels. And I do firmly believe that Donald Trump is the biggest problem in terms of race relations in our country right now. I also believe those who enable him don't serve us or do us justice either. And I think that's the current governor. So beyond that, in terms of systemic practices, certainly the criminal justice system, and I'm sure we'll talk more about it, Dottie. So, but there's a number of distinct policy changes that we need to pursue within the criminal justice system, and I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you.
So can you repeat the question, please, Dr. Morris?
Oh, yes, sure. What do you think are 3 pressing issues for people of color in the United States in general, but specific to New Hampshire? And what is your analysis of how these issues are having an impact on people of color living in New Hampshire? Or do you think that people of color are not experiencing these issues?
So the last part of that question, I'll answer first.
Okay.
Because I know for a fact that people of color are experiencing systemic racism in New Hampshire. I had a conversation with some BLM members over the summer to find out, not only have a discussion about topics where we agree, but also, find out, please educate me on things that I don't necessarily know. Because, any sort of speculation that I make about what it's like to be Black in America is pure speculation because I haven't lived that. But I again, based on these conversations, I can tell you that yes, people of color in New Hampshire are experiencing this. As someone looking at what's happening, specifically at the marches, the Black Lives Matter protest, where the people are saying, please stop killing people that look like me. And you have counter protesters to that. Just boggles my mind. So there's a lot of issues specifically with the police that need to be addressed, specifically around the use of force and the escalation. How can police go about escalating? Should they be required to attempt to de-escalate first? And I would say yes. I would also say that instead of simply a duty to report misconduct or use of force, there should be a duty to intervene, where if you are a police officer and you see one of your coworkers using excessive force, instead of just taking some notes that wind up getting filed away that never becomes public, you should intervene. You should be that mythical good cop to stop the supposed bad apple from violating someone's rights. And of course, the criminal justice system, where again, you have some sentencing discrepancies between what people that look like me get and what people of color wind up getting. Those are all things that need to be addressed. And if elected, I know that I would be able to work with both Republicans and Democrats to address those issues and get some real change.
Thank you. So if you have any questions, remember to put them in the chat box. If not, I'll keep going with some questions, okay? So my next question, as you both know, there are many people in New Hampshire who are immigrants and refugees. The late Alan Johnson asserted that the United States is the most racialized country in the world. How do you think immigrants and refugees in New Hampshire are being affected by how they are defined racially, especially when they don't think that those categories apply to them? So really the question is the thoughts around the experiences of immigrant and refugee individuals who are being defined racially and they're not quite seeing themselves in that light. So how do you think it's having an impact on their quality of life?
I would say it has a negative impact. Anytime you're stereotyped in a negative way, and I assume that there could be, circumstances where someone is positively stereotyped, but that's certainly not what we think of when we think of stereotypes and prejudice. It is going to wind up having some kind of effect, whether it's on your day-to-day life specifically, or if it's something that slowly wears on you mentally and affects how you wind up interacting with people. I live in downtown Manchester, very close to Veterans Park, which is actually, somewhat ethnically diverse. The little corner store that I go to all the time is run by immigrants from somewhere in like the Central Asia area. I'm not sure exactly what country they're from, but I do know that they're immigrants. And I don't interact with them differently than I would interact with anybody else. But there are people that think that, oh, well, I can wind up stealing from this store and get away with it because, just whatever reason they have of why they think they can get away with it. So there are people that do interact differently with immigrants. And then, of course, we have the census that either just ended or ends in a week. I'm not sure exactly what the courts wound up deciding last week on that. But you've got the president and the head of the Department of Commerce that want to wind up not counting certain immigrants in the census, even though the US Constitution says that account of all people. It doesn't say account only of citizens. It doesn't say account only of registered voters. It doesn't say account of only, who the president wants to count. It's all people. So again, as Senator Feltus said, when you have a president that is, making all of these talking points, it's no wonder that, people start emulating that and treating people that are immigrants differently. That there's even been things where Native Americans have been told to go back where they came from, just because, oh, well, they look like they might not be, that pure white ethno-European whatever, and racist people want to, just be racist, and I wish it would end.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have thank you, Dr. Morris. We have a vibrant New American communities throughout New Hampshire, and emphasis on New American because they're American. And we need to work to include and lift up their experiences. And that's why community groups like YWCA and others are so important. And I know YWCA just had its 100th birthday. Happy birthday, YWCA. And so many wonderful community groups working together to build a more inclusive and stronger New Hampshire. Our diversity is our strength, and we need to lift each other up. And, look, public service takes many different forms. You don't have to run for governor or state senator to provide a public service. Folks who are working on the ground in our communities and providing community service and working to include people and lift people up, that's a public service. And so we need to work together, continue to work together to make sure that we include each other in our economic and democratic experience, small d.
Okay, we have a question in the chat box. I'm gonna turn my camera off so I can look a little closer. Give me just a minute. Okay, the person says, I have a question. New Hampshire is not immune by racism. One shouldn't have to look at another person of color to know that it is systemic racism based on what they hear from their peers, friends, and family. My question, why wait until you hear it from a person of color? Why haven't they know this for what they see and hear, from what they see and hear? See no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil doesn't mean evil isn't there. Please address this issue. So I think it's related to, talking about, finally hearing from the Black Lives Matter folks and other people that it existed. And so the question has to do with why do we have to wait to hear it directly? I think that's the question.
Right. And I just want to clarify, and apologies if I wasn't clear earlier. I've known that systemic racism has existed for a long time. My conversation with members of BLM was not only to talk about the systemic racism and ways to address it and ways that I think it should be addressed, but also to get their perspective on other things that aren't necessarily as apparent. The snide comments that, I thought happened possibly behind their back. I found out, no, they're happening to their face. As a white person, and it's not something that I condone, but people are a little more open with words around somebody that looks like them. And one of the members of BLM that I spoke with said, no, I hear it to my face all the time. Like they don't wait until I turn my back to say something. And that's not something that I knew that happened in New Hampshire, specifically in Manchester, New Hampshire, that does have a slightly higher than state average minority population. So those are the things, not the systemic racism. That's not what I wanted to get the information about during my conversation with BLM. I wanted to find out more about the everyday racism that they experience that I personally, that there's no way for me to experience that myself. So that's something that I do have to learn from a conversation.
Thank you.
And did that clarify, Dr. Morris or Gloria?
Was that, do you have a follow-up? I think you're muted, so.
Thank you. It kind of went around the question. It didn't answer specifically. So
okay.
It doesn't satisfy my request for the right answer or
okay. And again, apologies for not answering the question as directly as you would like. I'm attempting to. And the question, as I'm seeing it, it says, if you know that systemic racism exists, why wait to hear about it before saying something? And again, I wasn't waiting to hear from BLM members that systemic racism existed, because I've known that it has existed. I've testified to legislative committees about sentencing reform, about getting rid of the drug war. My conversation with BLM members was more on how can we address these things together, and what is your day-to-day experience being a person of color, because that's not something that I can experience for myself.
Any other comments? I will go back to the chat box. I would like to hear the candidate's position on HR 40 legislation, reparations for people of African descent. So the person would like to hear, I'm assuming, your opinions, your thoughts, your reflections on HR 40.
Well, as I've discussed this in the past, obviously this is best done, in my view, at the federal level. Obviously, HR 40 is a federal legislation. So, but it needs to be actively considered, and we'll see what Congress does. But more generally, the systemic practices and the economic impact, historic economic impact within the structures, even in New Hampshire, setting aside federal legislation, things like minimum wage, paid family and medical leave insurance, housing discrimination, criminal justice reform. We've made some progress on a whole host of these things to make sure that we make forward progress combating systemic discrimination. But there is a lot more work to do, and even issues like the minimum wage disproportionately affects workers of color, disproportionately affects women workers of color. And, it's been vetoed, the effort to reinstate and raise it. Meanwhile, the current governor took a pay raise for himself of $31,000 while vetoing the minimum wage. We need to move forward on sentencing reform, marijuana legalization. If you're in jail, that obviously you're not going to be able to live out your God-given potential. So look, I think the overarching conversation of what we can do at the state level needs to be focused on real economic relief, real systemic relief for communities of color, including creating the Office of Racial Equity within the governor's office to actually have a standing position, staff at the director of person of color, have statisticians work to identify systemic practices and policies that have a disproportionate negative impact on communities of color and work to rectify and eradicate it. Vermont set up an Office of Racial Equity in the governor's office. New Hampshire, when we win this race, will set it up on day one, an Office of Racial Equity within the governor's office to continue to lead on this and work together. And, look, we got to continue to work together. That's why these conversations are important. Having honest conversations about where we're at, where we're heading. When I say the best ideas come from the ground up, not the top down, that means having these conversations and continue to have them after we win. And, continue to engage in these conversations. Look, we had I'll just point it out too. We had another one of these with conversations that were critical on critical issues. Gloria knows, greater Nashville NAACP, and Kristen didn't show up for that either. Look, not everybody agrees on 100% of the issues 100% of the time. That's called democracy. But also, it means that you show up and you listen and you talk and you have conversations about how we move forward together. And that's what I commit to doing after we win this race. Well, through the race, through the next 14 days, and then after too.
Thank you.
So I'm looking at the information on HR 40 that's provided by the congressional website, and it shows here that a subcommittee hearing, not even a full committee hearing, but a subcommittee hearing within the House Judiciary Committee was held in June of last year. No action since. One thing that I really like about the New Hampshire legislative system is that every bill must have a full committee hearing, and the committee must make a recommendation that goes before the full chamber, whether it be the House or the Senate. That recommendation could be keep it within the committee for another year, but that recommendation still gets voted on. That recommendation can still get overturned. But here we have, and it's not just this bill, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of bills at the federal level that get referred to a committee or a subcommittee and then die without any action at all. This bill also is a commission to study reparations. So it's not even a bill to give reparations. It's a commission to study reparations. This bill should have been passed the day after it had that subcommittee hearing. And the subcommittee hearing should have been held earlier, but they probably decided, oh, you know what? Let's hold it on Juneteenth, which is the day that they had the hearing. And there was probably some big photo op of, see, we're having this hearing on Juneteenth. And then as soon as people stopped paying attention, they just quietly let it die in committee. That's not the way to operate things. And as the senator said, there are a lot of things that wind up preventing people that have a criminal record from moving forward. We need to ban the box, where right now in New Hampshire, employers can ask the question of, have you ever been convicted of a crime? It isn't, have you ever been convicted of a violent crime? Have you ever been convicted of a crime directly related to the job that you would be doing here? It's, have you ever been convicted of a crime? And if you mark yes, then that application goes straight into the circular file. And we have a housing shortage. And one of the first things that landlords do is they look for any of the applicants that have a criminal record of any sort and anybody that has a lapse in rental history and anybody with an eviction. And they throw those applications in the circular file. You don't wind up, helping people move up and better their life by making them homeless and unemployed. Those are things that need to be addressed. And as the senator said, we need to have these conversations. And Senator, you have probably noticed that none of the forums that I have attended have been attended by Chris Sununu. I don't know if he's scared of me specifically, or if he just doesn't want to wind up, legitimizing my candidacy.
Thank you very much. We have about 14 minutes, so and we have a few more questions. There's a thank you to both of you in the chat box for participating. So thank you both again. So, as governor, what are 3 things you are planning to do to address the impact that race has on the lived experience of people of color within the Granite State? So what are 3 things you're thinking about putting into place?
So I'm going to refer back to criminal justice reform, where, again, people of color are much more likely, 5 times more likely, based on recent statistics, to be incarcerated in either jail or prison in New Hampshire. That needs to change. We need to get rid of the drug war, which, again, disproportionately affects minorities and people in lower incomes. And unfortunately, minorities in New Hampshire are more likely to fall into those lower income brackets. We need to get rid of that. It's all part of the systemic racism that exists. We need to, because New Hampshire is not a home rule state, municipalities can only do what they have been specifically authorized by statute to do. We need at the state level to pass a statute that prohibits municipalities from creating zoning ordinances that harm minorities and people in lower incomes. Here in Manchester, where I live, there are some areas that are designated as R3, meaning it's residential, but the limit on the size of the building is it can't be more than 3 stories. It can be multifamily, but it can't be more than 3 stories, which discourages people from building a apartment complex. If you can't go more than 3 stories and you only have a fairly small plot, you're going to wind up at most building a duplex with a mother-in-law suite. And when you do that, you're not creating affordable housing. If anything, you're just creating more of the luxury apartments, which is unfortunately what we're seeing too often, where the current affordable housing is being purchased and then turned into luxury apartments, which just exacerbates the housing crisis that we have. That's something that needs to change. And also mixed use neighborhoods that wind up making it difficult for people to work in the neighborhood where they live, especially if somebody doesn't have a car and there's not good public transportation, which exists in most of New Hampshire does not have good public transportation, which means that if you live in a low income area and you don't have a car, it's going to be incredibly difficult for you to find work that you can reliably get to. And again, this is something that the state could address. The state legislature could address this because we are not a home rule state. The city of Manchester can't just make whatever zoning ordinance they want. They can only make zoning ordinances that the state has authorized them to make. So a lot of these things, such as redlining and other discriminatory practices that basically create segregated neighborhoods, can be, again, addressed at the state issue. And banning the box, legalizing cannabis, allowing people that have had cannabis convictions to work in the legal cannabis industry would go a long way towards letting people better themselves. Where in Colorado, Washington, Massachusetts, Maine, anyone with a cannabis conviction is prohibited from working in the now legal cannabis industry. I don't understand why people are being punished now for something that they did years ago when what they did is now legal.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We already talked a little bit about the Office of Racial Equity, but I want to focus on 4 things if I can, and just hit some high points: housing justice, healthcare justice, economic justice, and criminal justice reform. And starting with the latter, criminal justice reform, we talked a little bit about it, but legalization of marijuana and the criminalization of marijuana, which has been a disaster for communities of color. We need to move forward on that. Need to move forward on ban the box. I sponsored that legislation, Senate Bill 100. It was vetoed. We overrode the veto in the state Senate. Couldn't get the votes in the House, but we got to move forward on that. I agree, and also move forward on that in the housing context as well. In terms of housing, we got a housing plan on our website. You can take a look at it. And it lays out a number of key elements to move forward on housing, including making sure that we create some state level Section 8 vouchers for chronically homeless in the state. That's something that other states have done. As I mentioned, ban the box in the housing context. Making sure we ramp up supply of housing through the Workforce Affordable Housing Fund, which we capitalized for the first time in state history in the last budget. We got to build off of it and make sure that the rapid rehousing funds are there. It was unilaterally cut by Chris Sununu a couple months ago in this pandemic. We know the housing first model matters and has significant positive outcomes, healthcare and socioeconomic outcomes, particularly for communities of color. So getting folks into housing is critical. Economic justice. Talked a little bit about the minimum wage. Got to reinstate it and go gradually up to 15. paid family and medical leave insurance is critical, especially in COVID right now. We're seeing some of those disparities. And lastly, healthcare justice. We have a healthcare plan on our website. You can take a look at it. But let me be abundantly clear. If Judge Barrett is confirmed by the U.S. Senate, there's a U.S. Supreme Court argument on November 10th concerning the constitutionality of Obamacare. If Obamacare is repealed, which Chris Sununu has a long history of arguing for repeal, if it's repealed, that would devastate our health care system here in New Hampshire. Absolutely devastated. Over 100,000 would lose their health insurance, 50,000 off Medicaid alone. Community rating would be gone, price caps would be gone, support for assisted living, community mental health, among others, would be gone. Our providers would go under, access would go down, costs will go up, and it would disproportionately fall on lower income communities and disproportionately fall on communities of color. So we are facing a major crisis in our healthcare system right now. And healthcare is on the ballot. Make no mistake about it in this election. So if we're going to move forward, we got to protect, stabilize, and build off of our healthcare system. I'll also mention, in terms of healthcare, women of color are disproportionately more likely to die in childbirth, disproportionately more likely to have pregnancy complications because of the lack of preventative care and prenatal care. And Chris Sununu has worked to defund Planned Parenthood. Chris Sununu actually took CARES Act money and diverted it to an anti-choice, quote unquote, counseling center, rather than giving it to the centers, the healthcare providers on the ground that actually provide healthcare services. So look, the distinction in this race could not be more clear. And we got to go forward. We go forward on housing justice, economic justice, healthcare justice, and criminal justice reform. We got to go forward on all four of those, and they're inextricably linked.
Well, I have a question in the chat bucket, and there's some great other comments and questions in the chat box, but this will be the last one. And again, if you could just take a couple minutes to answer it, because I think that this is a very key question related to the future of New Hampshire. What are your preventive plans or steps to put in place to keep young people of color from the school to prison pipeline to the school to achieving their full potential as citizens? So what are some things that you're thinking about as it relates to the youth of color? Because if you look at the statistics, that's the number that's growing significantly within the state of New Hampshire.
Well, if I may, Dr. Morris, and thank you, Darryl. We passed legislation this last session, comprehensive school discipline reform bill to try to get at the school to prison pipeline. We work with groups like ACLU, Disability Rights Center, among others, to put that into effect. It's going into effect right now. Obviously, we have fairly unique circumstances right now in our schools. There's no school reopening plan at the state level, no public health guidance. It was all punted down to the local level. People are scrambling. It's chaos. They don't know what's going on. People who sign up for school boards do it in good faith to serve the public, to serve their community. They're not epidemiologists. And so there's a little bit of chaos right now. And so implementing it at the local level is something that needs to move forward, but it's in a little bit of a difficult situation right now, given where our schools are right now. And so I think what we need to do is make sure that as best as possible under the current challenging environment, A, we create an actual school reopening plan with public health standards to support our communities, and B, we make sure some of the reforms that we put in place move forward. And we actually look at the statistics and see how it's implemented and see what impacts it has on students of color.
Thank you.
The best way to get rid of the school to prison pipeline is to reform the criminal justice system, prevent police departments from using predictive policing, which is basically looking back 5 years on arrest and conviction records and putting that data into a computer. And then the computer says, well, here's where most of your arrest and convictions came from. And that determines where they're going to put more resources. So when you put in flawed data because of the racist war on drugs and all of the other victimless crime laws that we have, where you know that you can, very easily harass minorities and people of lower incomes and get that easy plea conviction, because people that are in higher income brackets, they can afford good lawyers to wind up fighting pretty much any charge. Just ask O.J. Simpson. But people that are in that lower income bracket, they just want the charge to go away. Make the charge go away. I'll plead guilty to anything. Just let me go home. And that's how you wind up with wrongful convictions, because people are essentially forced into a plea deal. So get rid of the criminal or reform the criminal justice system, get rid of the war on drugs, depenalize all illicit substances, get rid of qualified and prosecutorial immunity so that when police and prosecutors do things that they know are wrong to get an arrest or a conviction, they can be held personally liable instead of being protected by the government shield of qualified and prosecutorial immunity. These are things that need to change. And once you stop arresting people simply for, the offense of being Black, and we'll pin something on them later and figure out what the actual charge is, then minorities and lower income individuals can wind up having that potential to go to college, get the federal student aid, get the Pell Grants, because they don't have these criminal records that prevent them from access to these funds.
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna time you. I'll give you 30 seconds. Last words. Who wants to go first?
I'll go first.
Just any final thing you would like to say. 30 seconds.
Yep, 30 seconds. I'll do it in less. Again, Darryl Perry, Libertarian for governor, running on a platform of criminal justice reform, lower taxes, supporting your right to vote, protecting your right to vote, and ballot access reform. You can learn more about me, where I stand, at darrylwperry.com. And I do host a town hall every Thursday, darrylwperry.com/Zoom.
Thank you.
Dr. Morris, yeah, you got it. You got it. It's great to see everybody. Thank you for involving me. It was great to have this conversation. I look forward to future conversations in this race. I respectfully ask for your vote. More importantly, I respectfully ask you to vote and to get your friends and your family and your community members to vote. Get out and vote. Let's go vote. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thanks for everything you do.
And thank you all for participating, both candidates and all of you who sent in questions, and most of all, for appearing today and listening. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Jessica.
Well, thank you, Dr. Morris. What a great conversation we had today. Special shout out to Senator Feltes and Darryl for joining us and participating. As I mentioned before, these things don't happen in silos, they happen in collaboration. And we've been working with Keene State College and Dr. Morris and the Hampshire Black Women's Health Project on how we can begin to move forward in addressing these issues that are more action oriented. So we need to, our nation's more polarized than ever, and we need to move from topics of conversation to topics of action. And so YWCA has pivoted in 2020 and will be pivoting moving forward to our mission statement around eliminating racism. So follow us, join us. We need to continue these conversations. We need to continue in action in solidarity. That's the only way that we are going to move the needle on any of these critical issues in our country right now. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And thank you for everything you're doing.